Welcome to Mostly Together. I'm so happy you're here. Thank you for being here. This is the first episode. So excited to get right into the show. And I wanted to start the show off with someone who really reflects what the show is all about. So today's guest is Neha Ruch, who is the founder and author of The Power Pause, and whose work on motherhood and ambition has been featured in outlets like, just to name a few, the New York Times, The Cut, and The Drew Barrymore Show. Naya and I actually go back a bit. I had interviewed her about a year and a half ago, and it was interesting because our conversation then really kind of comes full circle now. I've experienced my own version of a power pause. So we're talking about redefining ambition, navigating change, and building a life that feels aligned, even when it doesn't feel like it's the path that you expected you were going to take. So please enjoy this first episode and my conversation with Neha Ruch. All right, first episode, here we are. Neha, you were actually one of the last people that I spoke to on my last podcast. And a lot has changed since then, I have to say.
Isn't that wild? Life is so long, and yet a lot happens in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, and things that you can't, like, foresee or, you can even picture how it's gonna go, I last year at this time when I was talking to you, I never thought that I was gonna have my own podcast and be sitting here in my studio dining room.
I know, but what a special way to take all of that great experience and put it into a space that's so meaningful to you on many levels.
Yes. We all have such a story and a trajectory, and I can't wait to, dive into that for our listeners and viewers. And that's why I felt it was really important to have you on as my first guest because I've gone through my own power pause. And I feel like it's brought me to this point, and I'm want to like shout from the rooftops, like what my experience has been like and how your book has been so instrumental. And that's why I kind of want to start our conversation in a little bit of a different spot than before because I'm so curious the moments that led up to your power pause. And I think that there are so many people out there that also have had those moments perhaps or little like glimpses of those moments, but maybe they don't want to lean into it out of fear,
Mm.
out of doubt, self-doubt. So let's back it up from the beginning here. You're from Massachusetts, first of all, right?
I am from a small town outside of Boston. Where are you from?
Oh, I'm from Massachusetts too.
It's funny. I feel like I got that energy from you.
And you said that your family moved around a lot, right?
Well, not
How old were
really,
you?
they did one colossal move. They moved
Okay.
from India when I was 3.5. We immigrated to Acton, Massachusetts. So we went to one town. My mom somehow, before the internet, figured out that it was a town with a phenomenal school district. And within the town, we moved, our homes are quite a bit, quite
Mhm.
frequently, especially as we were still, somewhat temporary in the country. Uh, but no, Acton was home all the way through until college.
I moved around a little bit too after my parents got divorced. So,
Yeah.
like 11 years old, and I probably went to, I think, about three different school districts between like 12 years old, and then graduating high school. And that was a really tough age to do that. Yeah. But I feel like I almost had a clean slate each move, and I was always very outgoing and gregarious, so I didn't have a hard time, like, talking to people and meeting friends, but, I don't know, I felt like I already had, like, a little taste of reinventing yourself and really finding out, like, what works, what doesn't because of that experience. Um, and it's interesting because you get that question, right? Like, when you're in school, and I know you talk about this a lot in the book, like, "What do you wanna be when you grow up?" Which is such a loaded question to ask, like, someone in elementary school.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's so funny. What do you want to do has come to stand in for who are you, right? Which I think is why it's so challenging as ambitious women who are sort of raised on a really feminist, on second wave feminism, when we come face to face with the idea of like, do we want to downshift? Do we want to pause? There's a lot of fear of losing everything about who we are if we part with our job title. And I think it starts when we're young and people are asking, well, what do you want to be? We're essentially saying to these children, like, everything about your future relies on what you do for a living, right? We're giving it so much power and so much emphasis that it's hardwired by the time we're then in our 30s that what we do is a colossal way of explaining who we are in the world.
And I also feel that it instills this fear that you can't color outside the lines and check out other things that are out there. And then, of course, you have people, midlife, having that, wow, I can't believe I spent all this time doing this. I actually really didn't want to do that. You know what I mean? So it's unfortunate. And then you have like the route of some people who they don't know what they want to do and they just kind of keep going through school, but then the student loans add up, right? And then you're kind of locked in like, okay, well, I have to find a job no matter what. It doesn't really matter what I want to do or what I don't want to do.
Right, right. Well, you're talking about so many aspects of our sort of flawed relationship with career, right? We put so
Mm.
much emphasis on it that in some ways we think, oh, it needs to be our entire purpose, right? And if this isn't like fulfilling every aspect of ourselves, it's not a fit. But for those kids who need a job that pays the bills or pays the loans or whatever it is, whether you're 25 or 45, it's okay for a job to
Right.
be a financial resource. That's fine. As long, and I think sometimes we put so much stock on our careers having to be our everything.
Hmm.
That then you get into like a flawed relationship where you're unhappy because this career that's paying the bills isn't doing everything else for you. So there's that. And then there's this other side of it, which is if you do have the privilege to get to choose and you're in a career that isn't fulfilling you, but you're holding on to it because it somehow sort of is what you have done and represents something about you, then there's that other sort of flawed aspect of it,
Hmm.
right? And so it's a really tricky moment of reexamination of work in entirety, and it's deeply nuanced. Um, and it looks different for each person, right? Everyone
Hmm.
has to figure out what their relationship with their work is gonna be for this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. There is not a one size fits all for this. Were there moments in your life where you felt like you took little mini pauses? Like there was something you're like, I would love to do that, but it just doesn't make sense, like I need like a 9 to 5 job, for example, or, I know I
Well,
have those moments where I thought, it would be really cool to just move to New York City after high school and eat ramen on some studio apartment floor, subletting with 4 other people. But, like, I was fearful that that wasn't practical and what society, that pressure, right? Like, they expect us to do big things and you have
yeah.
to be something, but that doesn't always equate to getting there. You know what I mean? In some people's eyes.
Yeah. It's interesting. After several years of growing up in Acton, I think, by my late teens, right before high school, before college, excuse me, I there was something I recognized in myself wasn't feeling aligned. Like I was acting in a way that felt like I was trying to pretend to be someone I wasn't. And I knew that. I didn't have the language for it, but something didn't feel right. And I came downstairs the morning of my graduation. I'd already been accepted into my undergraduate program. And I had said to my parents, I really wonder if my college would allow me to defer for a year because something in me wants to go back to India for a year and just,
Wow.
um, I didn't even really have a plan as to what I was going to do. That plan would take shape, but I knew I wanted to be with people who looked like me for a year. I wanted to feel what it would feel like to belong. And I knew that something in that would grant me sort of a sense of perspective before I went to college. So I said to my
Hmm.
parents, like, I wonder if I go away for a year if something about going there would kind of let me, if I don't care so much about fitting in, maybe I'd be able to figure out who I really was. And I did. I went from August of 2002 to the following year. My Dean Bates at Skidmore allowed me to come back um, the year following. And I think it was this moment of realizing that actually breaking from the path can like reset you. It's sometimes your body, your mind just need that. And I knew it at a very young age. And then the next time, it's interesting. I went very quickly into advertising and loved advertising. I got very lucky to graduate at a moment where Twitter had yet to be born. And so I stepped right into a social media role right before the boom. And so my career escalated pretty quickly because they gave a 22-year-old a job that was probably, would later become a much bigger role and have a bigger slice of
Mhm.
the pie and a conversation. And I found myself maybe at like 27, like 5 or 6 years later, I found myself being like, oh, wow, I'm in over my head. I have a bigger job than I am old enough for.
Mhm.
And politics are above my pay grade and my life experience. And I knew I wanted something different. And someone described business school to me as a train stop to surround myself with smart people and figure out what comes next. And I was lucky enough to get into Stanford and I went for 2 years. And it was exactly that. It was sort of a way in which to take a beat and explore a little bit. But the irony I always say is that by the time I would eventually downshift and then pause for motherhood, I really was looking for what I found in both of those things, and I found it in motherhood. I found sort of this moment of my kid doesn't want me to be anyone besides who I am, so I feel like I fit, right? Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't have to work so hard on belonging, and there was something really freeing in that, so I found what I found in India. And then the reality is when you are on playgrounds and play spaces, you're surrounded by smart people, and you
Mhm.
have these naps and night times to figure out what comes next. And so, yeah, I found sort of this um, the great gifts that from my previous pauses in that pause for
Mm. Wow, I love how you took that time that you needed and you felt that misalignment that I think we always feel at certain times in our lives. Again, not everyone makes that move, to try and figure out, "Well, how am I going to feel more aligned, or how do I hit the pause button for a second and just kind of recalibrate a little bit?" Um, and especially like at 18 years old, I think that that's such an important time to do that, right? When we're really trying to find ourselves. And it's funny that, you know, you were feeling that way at that age, because I feel like when I was at that age, I, you know, I wanted to like take on the world, and I'm like, I can do anything. And then now here I am 20 years later going, I can do anything with this power pause. I feel like I'm 18 again, only I'm a mother of two, you know?
with a lot of lived experience and perspective, right?
Right.
Well, I did not feel that way at 18. I think I did when I came back. I remember
Okay.
and I felt really strong. I felt strong, but I
Mm.
wasn't right before. And I think, you come into these moments, yes, from a place of like longing for something else, right?
Mhm.
And whatever that longing is, like a different version of yourself. And at each of those junctures, I can say, like, I was looking for that. So with
Mhm.
sort of different levels of intensity,
Mhm.
motherhood, but it's interesting, when you're feeling that misalignment, I didn't immediately pause. And I should clarify that I downshifted to part time work. And I think that's a really important thing to call out because, sort of similar to you, it was like sometimes you need to use a scratch pad for a little bit you're like, if something feels like, oh, I want something, but I don't yet quite know what it is, it's okay to test different versions
Mhm.
to try and make what's working right now work better. And I think that I did do that. And I think you did do that, where like in
Mhm.
your existing role, you carved out ways in which to feel like, oh, I'm going to feel more creative or I'm going to feel more ownership. I felt like, okay, I'm going to had more separateness from politics if I go into sort of a fractional role and I have some
Mhm.
this. Um, I'll have more time if it's part-time, and so I think that's an important side too, which is when you feel that misalignment, sometimes you have the immediate answer and it's fully pausing, and
Mhm.
sometimes it's, like, making little tweaks within what you have existing,
Right.
make room for something else.
So you were talking about how, at 27 years old, you felt, wow, this is a lot. You were named the first digital strategist at one of the largest advertising agencies in Boston, and then you moved to a windowed corner office with harbor views or harbor views.
That office most beautiful I'll ever have again.
And 24 years old. I
Yeah, so I started at a very my first job out of college was at a tiny social media agency. It was a social media influencer agency, ironically. And my sole job was the T-Mobile was my account. So they were marketing towards moms and was to understand how moms were using social media.
Oh,
And yeah, that was 2006, right? And
wow.
so it was like the era of the OG mom bloggers like Heather Armstrong, RIP, and, really this incredible wave of women using digital forums to share how they were truly feeling.
Mhm.
And so I was reaching out to these women at 22 years old, right? And um, I was trying to figure out how to learn about these people. And I came up with this way to use social media to really gather insights around them and sort of triangulate it and put it into these presentations. My boss hired me as the number two to build the digital strategy. I had an entirely there were only three other digital strategists and they were all male. And
Mhm.
I
Good for you.
never had, I think that's the one piece of this. I never had a feeling like I couldn't compete with
Mhm.
men. I never had that in my career. I worked with product because at the time, the digital side of agency life and the digital media side was very male dominant. And I got nothing but respect. I got really well compensated for what I was doing. And I think that helped me. There was a little bit of
Mhm.
a not innocence, maybe innocence that
Mm.
like women we don't have to worry. Like we are actually like well suited for this work if we
Mhm.
thing we love, and I did love it very much until I
I
didn't.
feel like you're the modern day Peggy Olson, it sounds like, with Mad Men. Like, Peggy didn't let anyone push her around. She was like, I can work with a whole team of men. I don't care. I'm going to do this. And she worked her way to the top, you know?
And it was and it really did feel that agency was run by a woman. I should call out, it had a female CEO. Now, many of them had stay-at-home husbands, so I think that was, like, an
Yeah.
interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
So I got very lucky. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes life is about luck, and I feel like I took the right job out of college, and I had the right boss who was willing to bet on me and, like, didn't
Mhm.
care that I was so young. And I would combine that if we're talking about sort of innocence. A lot of people will be like, "How did you face female dynamics or women in the workplace issues?" And I, like, really did. I actually thought women had more power than men. I truly believe
Mhm.
in the work I was doing because I think
Mhm.
in that setting in particular, we have such a grasp on language and insight, a way in which to tell stories that is a gift in that
Mhm.
um, and then the other side of it is I grew up in a home where my dad was an entrepreneur, serial entrepreneur, and then inventor. But before, when he was building his first companies, my mom was his backbone, right? Like
Yeah.
she was the informal head of HR. She was his
Mhm.
like sounding board for everything. He she was at home with me for years, but then went back part-time and was always volunteering. So similarly, I never really overthought motherhood and work either. Like I didn't think it was so binary in the black,
Mhm.
so stay at home and working.
Mhm.
And I've been asked, so when you came into motherhood, what did you think, like, how had you thought about motherhood previously? And I really don't think I had. Like, I knew I wanted to be a mother, but
Right.
I hadn't thought about motherhood and work at odds with each other in a similar ways I had not thought about men and women at odds with each other.
Okay.
Maybe
So
delusional is what
yeah.
real
Well,
here.
I mean, it's all part of our experiences, though. And it's funny that you brought up your parents because I think sometimes we all look to what our parents did, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's what we have to do. However, if we're raised a certain way, my dad was a chef. My parents had
Mhm.
a catering company and they had a restaurant in a country club. My mom was the backbone of that business, did all the books. She would, she did everything from waitressing tables. She, did all the books, handled all the insurance, everything, and stayed home with me during that time.
Wow.
And then when my parents got divorced, I saw her in the workforce because she was a single mother. So it was interesting to see her do both of those roles, right? And I grew up thinking, oh, you know, I love how like my dad cooks dinner. Like I would love to marry a guy that doesn't mind cooking dinner because I like to eat, but I don't really like to cook, you know? And I knew I wanted to be a mom, but same thing, literally what you just said. I didn't know how the 2 were going to exist together. I just said, "I'm gonna figure it out and make it work somehow," you
Yeah.
know?
Yes, and I do think that that is a really interesting, piece of this puzzle, right? Because
Yeah.
we all come in to motherhood and work with different experiences. I really think I held motherhood on a pedestal. Like, I really
Mhm.
thought it was just the most important job in the world because
Mhm.
and I thought it was creative and I thought it was fun, and I think that I was lucky that and I dedicate the book to my dad because I never I was raised believing that if someone did unpaid work in the home, their work was still crucial, that
Mhm.
they were still, like and because I remember my dad so distinctly always saying, "Our decision around money is our just always talking
Mhm.
about and sort of the access to capital as shared. Uh,
Mhm.
and so, and that is such a big part of being able to walk through career shifts in this era with dignity. It's feeling like whatever decision you make, if you are in a two-parent household, you're making it with this sense of sort of shared respect
Mhm.
around others' needs and wants and how you're contributing.
Right.
And so that sort of side of that piece, both for you and I think probably is a leg up in a way
Mhm.
because it's the expectation we had based on
Mhm.
how we were raised.
Right. Yeah, seeing our parents, like, work really well together in that
Yeah.
space. So I guess as I've been going through this power pause and with reading your book, I've been equating things to The Wizard of Oz in a way.
Oh,
We're like Dorothy. We set out on the yellow brick road, and then we get to Oz, and that's our goal, right? Is to get to Oz. Then we find out there's some old man behind a curtain that's running the whole operation, and it feels like a big lie. And we're left going, wait, this is it? Like, and how do I get back to Kansas? And, and the whole thing, how the answer lies within, right? When Glinda is like, no, 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 you can get home. It's been you all along. You hold the key. And
yeah.
I feel like that's what this journey has been like. I was grinding it out as a broadcast journalist and reporter and anchor and producer and, everything else I worked under and just, overnights and lack of sleep and the sacrifices that we've both made, to get to where we were at the top there in our jobs. And then, my curiosity is what was that breaking point or that moment for you where you went, whoa, 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 wait a second. Like, this is Oz? Like,
Yeah.
what led you to your book
Oh,
there?
wow, that's interesting. Um, so after business school, I landed what on paper was my dream job. I was running um brand marketing at a tech startup that was just like a very prominent tech startup in New York. And it was a phenomenal team. And I still think the world of them. And um at some point there was a counterpart who ran a different vertical um, of the business who pulled me into a room on my birthday to have some words about something that she felt had not gone well. Um, in the business. And I left just feeling like a shell of myself. I really did. I could not enjoy we were going to the Billy Joel concert that night. I couldn't enjoy it, like, any of it.
Mm.
And, um, and I remember it was around, I was either pregnant or I was about to be pregnant, something so, we were actively trying and I wasn't getting pregnant, so there was, like, a lot going on there, for me.
Mm.
And I said to my husband, like, "I don't see a world I can compartmentalize work from our family life. Like, I don't see a world that the human being I am right now is able to not let the stress of whatever goes down on an ordinary Tuesday impact dinner." And I knew about that time, like, I'm gonna wanna shift because I know that this chapter in my life, in my, at the time, early 30s, um, newly married, newly about, with child, was so special and I wanted to enjoy it. And that was sort of the precipice. I didn't end up leaving the role at that time. But when I had my first son, and then E like I've described before, I think I'd been looking for belonging my whole life, right? Like, and then, I think I was still looking at it in the workforce. And I thought that sort of the titles kind of insulated you and the
Yeah.
prestige of the role. And then I realized, wow, it doesn't matter how high up you are. Like, you can still be brought down in 30 seconds. And I feel like, you're kind of like watching your back. You're trying to do, and I didn't like that feeling. I
Mhm.
didn't want that feeling to be a part of who I was. And I knew I was good at what I do. And I love brand marketing. I love brands. I love brand
Mhm.
storytelling. I didn't at the time have the chops to handle the politics still. No amount of business school, 10 years of work experience had not done that for me. And I had him, and all he wanted, like I said, was me to be me, and there was something
Mhm.
so freeing and peaceful that I wanted to rest in that for a little bit.
Mhm.
And so I had him, and I downshifted. I had a client, not a client, I had a collaborator in brand work. You often, you're collaborating with different publications or different other media companies, one of those companies was and I had become very friendly, and I knew I could go part-time for her. And so I initially went part-time for her, and I loved it. It was like a really wonderful blend at the time of work and family because I was 2 days in the workplace doing what I love, but I had this sort of protection from the politics because I was only there 2 days.
Right.
And I was sort of an individual contributor, and we were talking about the tweaks. That was the tweak I needed. And when I got pregnant with my second, and life, started to life, and I was also meeting all these incredible women. You asked, like, what was the catalyst for the work I did? I was hearing from a lot of people. I was hearing this sort of outward pushback of like, "Do you feel like you're giving up? Like, you're not working as,
Mm.
like, at the capacity you were before? Like, is this it? Is this, like, are you bored during the days at home?" And meanwhile, I was meeting all these women, some of you and I, like, so dynamic, had so much experience, were either flexing for a period of time or they were, thinking about what might come next. They were really interested in how their kids were growing up and like their partners were cooking dinner at the end of the day. So they weren't like apron clad. And I thought, oh, this is like a real mismatch between the reality of women like us who've clocked in a decade of work experience or more, who are considering what comes next, who are slowing down their work for family life, and like, where did these tropes come from? And I started to peel back
Mhm.
the layers and realize, like, oh wait, it's 2016 and there's so much incredible content for the traditional working mother. It's the height of the lean in movement. And it seems to have left all of us out. Like, we are somehow counted out of conversation. So I started the work um as a very small blog and Instagram account to essentially start to explore women like myself who were
Wow.
pausing or downshifting. And I felt like, okay, there's a lot of great representation for the traditional working mother, but the stay at home mother has been left in the 1970s with apron strings or a Pinterest like mom or a home, all these like
Mhm.
that. Who's your mom? Like we've been characterized or the Real Housewives, but there's no
Yeah.
accurate depiction.
No.
And so that it started in that way in 2017.
And even in 2026, I still see the pressure, even amongst some of my friends, feeling like, well, I need to be like June Cleaver, but I also am working outside of the house and I want to do this, and it's like, it just doesn't, it's like oil and vinegar. Like, I mean, you're holding too much and it's going to burn you out at some point, I feel.
Well, no, I think you're referring to in advance of the book, I commissioned a survey called the American Mothers on Pause survey, and we surveyed 1,000 members of the general population and 1,200 at-home moms. And when we asked the general population, "Who do you think of as a stay-at-home mom?" They said June Cleaver, who is the fictional character from the show Leave It to Beaver. And when we asked a working mother, they said Michelle Obama, Sheryl Sandberg, and Beyonce. And the irony of Michelle Obama is, I'm sure if you haven't listened to her, you should, to her interview on Call Her Daddy, Alex Cooper's podcast. She talks about like her very real career shifts and downshifts,
Right.
right? And her pauses. And the reality that in her words, you can have it all, but you can't have it at the same time. And in my words, I would say you can have it all. You just have to define what your all is. And like
Mm.
my all doesn't look like your all. Right. And I think to your point about your friends, I think for so many women, we, once we get past the dialogues around feminism and identity and finances, and we finally say, like, okay, we're going to make a shift around work and family, then we think, okay, if like the majority of our life is spent in family life right now, then I guess success looks like well cooked meals, perfectly like dressed children, well-behaved children,
Mhm.
and we come up with this list of success metrics based on social media, which is just like a terrible comp of the ideal mother because it's corners of a lot of different people's lives, right? You might have a beautifully curated home and I might have great art projects, but on the flip side, you may never do art and my house might be a mess, right? But we're never seeing the trade-offs people are making. And so instead, we're just creating this composite that is really lending itself to a lot of pressure on what the ideal mother looks like, right?
Right.
And that's
Absolutely.
almost scarier than June Cleaver because now it's the woman working outside of the home and killing it. It's the woman cooking. It's the woman doing art part. It's a woman who's like volunteering at school, the woman with like the killer social life. And
Mhm.
in reality, we all have to pick and choose
Right.
in any given year. All right, these are the like 3 things or 4 things that I really, really, like, care about and,
Mhm.
like, shift my focus to,
Right.
and then everything else, maybe we let go of for a little bit or we delegate for a
Mhm.
little.
Right. Ah, that's like my favorite word, delegate. That's my advice for a lot of my
Right,
friends.
totally.
Like create a list and if you need some help, delegate in the areas where you need the help. Your strengths may be someone else's weakness, so don't compare to another household.
Yeah, 100%.
Aside from reading your book, what are the first steps that someone can take for that power pause?
Well, I think the first piece is some of what we touched on, knowing that you're not gonna become a nobody if you part with your title for a minute, right? Like, because actually all of that great work experience is going with you. Like, your years in broadcasting go with you. And I would actually suggest I did not do this, but I wished I had, and I talk about it in the book. I would update your resume and your LinkedIn when you leave your role, like, or
Mhm.
as that as possible, just because it's top of mind, all your little victories. Because when you go to do it 10 years later, like I did, you likely won't remember the sort of specifics that are what make those those experiences so stand out. And it's important to remember as an exercise that those experiences go with you, the skills go with you. And now I would reframe this chapter as like a chapter of non-traditional experience, right?
Mm.
And once you've gotten past the financial dialogue, because I do think that part's imperative, right?
Mhm.
Like, with your partner, if you aren't already budgeting, I highly recommend, an annual exercise, if not monthly, where you're looking at your spending and you're looking at the income. It sort of depersonalizes like who's contributing what. There's like a household income. This is the money in, this is the money out. And you have the conversations pretty early around like, what do we care about? Like, do we both care that someone is more available at home? Because if so, then that is a joint decision and we
Mhm.
all have access to the household income and it is shared. And so just establishing that, and obviously I spell that out. There's a lot of free resources on our site to sort of help guide that dialogue. Um, I think once you're in the day to day of your pause and you're like sort of getting your footing, I think that's when it gets the most crucial. Um, Becoming intentional. I think
Mhm.
so often we have inherited this idea that if we make room for family life, that's it. But I
Right.
think what the power pause sort of relies on, where the power comes from, is that when we make room for family life, we're actually making room for ourselves to grow and network and explore new ways. And that doesn't have to be big and grand and like a 2 day a week, situationship.
Right,
It
right.
can be, it can be, I'm going to decide at the top of this year that there are 3 areas, personal, professional, and family, that I wanna have some, loose goals around. And maybe my personal goal, thinking back to when I had a 1 and 3-year-old, right? My loose goal with on a personal level is less reactivity, more patience. Uh, on a
I hear that one.
community goal, it is I'm gonna have a silly household. And on a professional goal, I've always wanted to try writing, or podcasting. And then you might break it then into really tiny metrics to measure yourself by for the course of the year. And if you are in a year where you don't have any childcare and you're really relying on naps and night times and like your partner stepping in the mornings and the evenings, then like those are tiny metrics, right? For 1 year, it was like for me, it was 3 blog posts on a free website, Squarespace, a year or a week. Or I'm going to listen to one podcast a week on reactivity and patience
Mhm.
and motherhood, right? So it's tiny little ways to measure and account for us moving forward and give us a moment to come back the next year and say, okay, we have an expanded set of time. Like, how do I want to think about, building on those goals or exploring new ones? And I think, the where that leads is as you're out in the world, moving yourself forward, take stock of the relationships that you are forming in the pickup lines and the drop off,
Mm.
and
That,
like I
yeah.
was in play spaces because it might not be a formal network like you had in the workplace, but those are people in the shared life stage. And that is what networking is. It's relationships. And
Right.
maybe, when you're out and about and people are asking, you go from first talking about diaper bags and maybe then it becomes like, oh, what are you, what were you doing previously? How are you thinking about like work stuff? And suddenly you have a place to sort of sound out your ideas and know that you are not alone in
Right.
exploring. There's this wonderful example I have in the book of this woman, Priscilla, in Napa,
Right.
who was feeling so disoriented, but she met another woman at a book club. And they both said that they were feeling a bit lost. And the two of them met every single week
That's nice.
for
Yeah.
as backyard burrito sessions for accountability as they shape
Mhm.
their next chapter.
Mhm.
And that's the last part I would say is if you do nothing else, open a Google Doc and just start dropping in or an iPhone note, honestly, like just start dropping in all the little times that you feel proud of yourself
Mm.
or that your like interest is piqued, whether it's a podcast that like gets your attention or a piece of content on Instagram that you linger on or a time you helped a friend in production for their podcast, right?
Yeah.
Because even if it's free, even if it's just about consuming content, those dots, those random bullets start to leave clues for who you are, who you're interested in, what you're interested in, because that's what this time can be. It's a scratch pad
Right.
to explore when you're. and color outside the lines, as you started this conversation with.
So, the other side of this is what would you say to, those single mothers out there or those people who are caught between a rock and a hard place and, they really need something like a power pause, but they just feel like physically, even emotionally, they can be in the sandwich generation, caring for their elderly parents. They have two little kids, they're just kind of tapped out on all those fronts, and the well is dry, and they just don't know how they can y- get something, reap the benefit of something like this. It might not feel like an option to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first, I would say there is so much research to validate that whether you work out of the home or in the home or existing in between, it has no impact on your children's health and happiness, right?
Yeah,
There are
absolutely.
equally incredible outcomes possible for all children as long as they know they are loved and safe, which is possible in any context. So take that off the worry buffet.
I think every mom needs it tattooed on her forehead.
Oh my God,
Say
by
that.
the way, I always say that the goal of the power pause was never to say pausing is the right choice. It's to
Right,
say
right.
a valid choice in the long game of work and family.
Yeah. We got to lean on our community. Like you said, like the pick up and drop off lines. And I know we had an amazing community come through for us when I lost my mother-in-law last spring, and we were going through so much. She was on hospice. Like we literally, were traveling back and forth almost every day, like between an hour and 2 hours. And it would kind of got to the point where we were so grateful. My husband and I both had full-time jobs at the time, and we had to lean on our community, and they offered, or that the snow day uh, alert goes out at 6:30 in the morning, like last week. And, you see the group text with the moms, oh my gosh. And this mom, works outside of the home an hour away, doesn't know what she's going to do with her kids because, this place is closed. It's kind of, you have to kind of call all your players in on your team. It's so important, regardless of what your work situation is. I think, like you said, you need that base, you need that community.
And I think to offer also, to
Oh,
offer,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And because I
Return the
think,
favor.
you know, um, I think we all have something, and that's really where when I think about what I hope this work does, it's dismantled the division between stay at home and working. There's
Hmm.
so much to lean on for each other. Whether you're working out of the home or you're working on a small project that you can use someone else's help on, or you're currently at home and can be the home that, a friend's kid comes to on a snow day.
And do you feel that after going through your power pause and then writing this book, if someone were to say, Naya, who do you want to be? What do you want to do when you grow up? Is it easier to answer that now?
No, I just feel like there's a part of me that just says, like, I hope I get to keep doing what I'm doing. I mean,
Yeah.
some smudgy in between still, right? Like, I'm
Hmm.
picking my son in an hour and a half because fourth grade homework is no joke.
Oh my gosh,
And,
no.
um, and they teach math in a completely different way. But I
Yep.
really need the time.
Hmm.
Really, I love being able to continue to see this work out into the world and serve women who are often overlooked or dismissed, because I think we owe it all to each other to
Hmm.
to really lift one another up right now.
Well, Naya, where can people find the power pause?
You can buy it wherever you love to get books. You can find me on Instagram, Neha_Ruch, or on LinkedIn. And definitely take advantage of all the free resources on thepowerpause.com.
Naya, thank you so much for being my first guest.
You congratulations.
Thank you.
Wait to see this grow.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning in to this first episode of Mostly Together. And thank you again to Neha Ruch for coming on as the first guest. This is only the beginning. I'm so excited. And again, I appreciate you being here. For all things that Neha talked about, head to thepowerpause.com. For all things with Mostly Together, you can watch us every single week. The show is on YouTube, youtube.com/@mostlytogetherpod. The same handle, @mostlytogetherpod, is where you can follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and you can listen and take this podcast with you on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. So again, thank you so much for being here. Take what you need, leave the rest, and I'll see you next week.